Welcome to Discovering Joy with Roy, Part 2, the Beatitudes. I'm Roy, and today's Beatitude is the 8th from Matthew 5, 10 to 12. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. An irritated woman sent a letter to the editor of Time magazine. In it she waxed indignant about the recorded "please hold" messages you get when you're waiting for your call to be transferred. To keep you dangling, a voice periodically breaks into the music to assure you that your call is very important to us and your party will be with you any moment now. Probably everyone finds these recordings irritating. For this lady, though, irritating is too soft a word for what she feels as she waits on hold. I'm quoting her. She says, "The suffering takes endurance, if not restraint." Suffering, endurance, restraint. What words would she use to describe the suffering this beatitude describes? I'm afraid we affluent Westerners can endure anything but discomfort. Every visit to one of the developing or third world countries is a reminder that freedom is not universal. In many nations, to admit you're a Christian is to invite persecution, even death. Believers in those closed nations know what it means to carry a cross. They take their crosses up daily to follow Jesus. Their suffering really does take endurance. In that respect, they're imitating Jesus, who lived with ever-growing criticism from the beginning of his public ministry until its explosion in full-scale persecution and death at the end. The Old Testament prophet Isaiah prophesied that the Messiah would be despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and familiar with suffering. And the Messiah, in turn, predicted that his disciples would suffer the same fate. Here's Jesus in John 15. "If the world hates you, keep in mind that it hated me first. If you belong to the world, it would love you as its own. As it is, you do not belong to the world, but I've chosen you out of the world. That's why the world hates you. Remember the words I spoke to you. No servant is greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they'll persecute you also. If they obeyed my teaching, they'll obey yours also." That's not a prospect that would appeal to the masses. Yet of himself as well as of his followers, Jesus says, "Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness." Persecuted, not merely discomforted or inconvenienced, but actively abused for doing right. As the earliest believers said of themselves, we must go through many hardships to enter the kingdom of God. The Apostle Paul warned Timothy, "Everyone who wants to live a godly life in Christ Jesus will be persecuted." Some words from the book of Hebrews often come to mind when I'm feeling a little distressed because of criticism or long hours or whatever. "In your struggle against sin, you have not resisted to the point of shedding your blood." It isn't just sin we struggle against, but sinners, as the preceding verse indicates. "Consider him who endured such opposition from sinful men, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart." Discipleship is not for the timid. Well, this beatitude bears some looking into. Persecution is promised. Jesus foresaw a future of trouble. He had his own crucifixion to face. His disciples after him would confront their own forms of persecution. Consider Paul and Silas, for example, who were cast unceremoniously into prison at Philippi for doing good. But instead of bemoaning their fate, which I probably would have done, they sang hymns and praised and entertained their fellow prisoners. This report doesn't surprise us today because we have the advantage of reading Paul's reflections on their experience while he was in another prison. Writing back to his friends in Philippi from his later Roman imprisonment, he wrote that this latest incarceration was a good thing because it has really served to advance the gospel. His guards and all others who learned of his situation, here he says that I am in chains for Christ. He may be temporarily sidelined, but the mission to which he had given his life is advancing, and doing so not in spite of, but because of his imprisonment. So he's not complaining, but rejoicing. Like Paul, Peter cautions his friends not to be surprised at the suffering they are enduring. They should, he says, rejoice that you participate in the sufferings of Christ, so that you may be overjoyed when his glory is revealed. They can consider themselves blessed when they're insulted because of their association with Christ. For the Spirit of glory and of God rests on you, he writes. And so it has been from the first century until now. Jesus' disciples have faced hardship of every kind. Christian history has been written, we are often reminded, with the blood of martyrs. For years I kept clippings from newspapers and magazines that gave horrendous accounts of Christians being persecuted for their faith. Let me read just this one, for example. A black evangelist was sewed up inside a tom-tom and starved to death while drummers pounded incessantly on the skin top. The bodies of several other Christians have been found buried up to their necks in sand, their heads swarming with ants. According to some reports, more than 130 native Protestant pastors and lay church leaders have been assassinated in the landlocked African Republic of Chad since last November. I'm not going to read any more of these clippings. The others are equally gruesome. I'll just give you a list of the countries where this was going on back then, and in many places still going on today. Cuba, Egypt, Algeria, Sudan, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Laos, Vietnam, China, North Korea. These are just the reports I say from one brief period. From beatings to starvations to imprisonment to prohibitions against preaching and worshiping together to, well, you get the point. The kind of freedom to worship and freedom from suffering we American Christians take for granted is simply not available to most believers around the world. The majority of Christ's disciples live where noble-sounding expectations like human rights and religious liberty are just fantasies, not attainable by them. The reality is far different. Open Doors USA is a nonprofit that tracks modern persecution and provides awareness of and encouragement to our persecuted brothers and sisters everywhere around the world. And what that report, their latest report, said is that every day 11 Christians are murdered for their faith and hundreds are persecuted. In light of these conditions then, we have to ask what Jesus means when he says the persecuted ones, well, of them is the kingdom of heaven. Theirs is the kingdom of heaven. They're already in the kingdom of heaven. Jesus uses the present tense in the Beatitude and a state of being verb. In other words, they are already enjoying heavenly relationships. They have received rewards that can't be comprehended by the earthbound, and they value what God values. That is, they value people above things. They may suffer for a while under the tyranny of some temporal dictator or hostile groups, but their real Lord is above all governments and principalities. They'll be law-abiding as far as possible, but they cannot bow the knee to anyone or anything but God. To clarify what this means, let me turn to an unlikely example. I've retained my childhood fascination with Albert Einstein. He died when I was in high school, and to my generation, he symbolizes smart. My continuing admiration now, though, has less to do with physics than with his humility before the great questions of the universe. When he died in 1955, he left behind on his desk his last incomplete statement. It was written to honor Israeli Independence Day. Here it is. What I seek to accomplish is simply to serve with my feeble capacity, truth and justice, at the risk of pleasing no one. Here they are, mind and heart conjoined. The search for truth wed to the search for justice. He exceeded in one more than the other, I have to admit. He himself once noted, politics are for the moment, an equation is for eternity. What I admire about him, though, is that his quest never ended, even though the risk cost him dearly. By the time he died, he was considered in the scientific community a back number, pushed to the side by the later stars. He was tolerated at best, and at worst he was scorned by some who thought of him as a latter-day Don Quixote, tilting at windmills. But what Einstein did for science, that is, serve at the risk of pleasing no one, Christians do for the sake of righteousness, and with the same predictable results. Yet, like Einstein, disciples of Christ do not give up. Our goal is not to hear the applause of our contemporaries, but the "well done, good and faithful servant" of our Master. The kingdom we live in is not limited to this world. We serve a king who cheers us on, even as others ridicule us. You see, the persecuted have the satisfaction of giving their all. The title of Oswald Chambers' most famous book says it all. He entitled it, "My Utmost for His Highest." Nothing is more gratifying than giving the most you have to offer to the highest cause there is. It was in this spirit that the Apostle Paul wrote to the Romans, "So, as much as in me is, I'm ready to preach the gospel." He couldn't give any more, and he couldn't give any better. Now, his commitment would cost him every form of discomfort and persecution. In spite of that, he would not be moved from his course. Nothing else was as satisfying. Paul's words come to mind when a few of us, came to mind, I should say, when a few of us Christians visited Kathmandu, Nepal. We were thrilled to learn of a genuine movement toward Christ among the Nepalese, a country that has long been hostile to the gospel. In 1990, there were approximately 25,000 Christians in the entire country. By 1996, the number was at least 300,000, meeting in around 2,000 churches. We were glad about these numbers, but we were saddened to learn the high price being paid for these conversions. Our host and his wife had been evicted from their home more than a dozen times in the past 3 years because they were Christians. New converts were disowned by their families, dismissed from their castes, fired from their jobs. The pastor's broken fingers spoke mutely of one imprisonment. Overt persecution continues to this day, even though it has subsided somewhat in the cities. Yet the joy of these believers, we discovered it was irrepressible. They're persecuted, but feel blessed. The persecuted take justifiable pride in being persons who can't be silenced. If they boast in the Lord, as 1 Corinthians 1:31 says. Having no strength of their own, they trust in the one whom they have believed, and here it is, convinced that he is able to guard what they've committed to him for that day. That's in 2 Timothy. They're like the beleaguered Woodrow Wilson, who was weakened by his paralytic stroke toward the end of his presidency. He was fighting a losing battle to lead the United States into the League of Nations. But he was determined to stand by his principles, whether winning or losing. He said, "I would rather fail in a cause that someday will triumph than to win in a cause I know someday will fail." Another thinker helped me, Paul Tournier. He was a Swiss Christian psychiatrist. His writings helped many of us young ministers a few decades ago. And he said somewhere that less than 7% of the human population have independent minds. It's no wonder there are so few when you consider how the majority brands and burns the minority as heretics. Edward R. Murrow was the famous correspondent during World War II, and he said he always deliberately took the side of the heretics against the persecutors because, he said, the heretics so often proved right in the long run. Dead, but right. So the battle is joined between the righteous, the fighters for justice and godliness in an unjust, godless world, and their tormentors. Read Paul's catalog of suffering for Christ in 2 Corinthians 11. He said that for Christ, he endured every indignity. He was overworked, imprisoned, flogged, exposed and left to die, beaten with lashes and rods, stoned, shipwrecked, adrift at sea, hunted, sleep deprived, hungry, thirsty, cold, naked, and under severe pressure on behalf of the churches. He was all this and more, but he was never silenced. He was like Sir Andrew Barton in the old Scottish ballad. "I am hurt," said Sir Andrew Barton. "I am hurt, but I am not slain. I'll lie me down and bleed a while, and then I'll fight again." So Paul, beset by all of this and by what he called his thorn in the flesh as well, he persevered. And he says of himself, he persevered, taking delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. In weakness, he discovered his strength. Not his strength exactly, but the strength of him who is able to do immeasurably more than all we ask or imagine, according to his power that is at work within us. Through that strength, and because of that strength, he could carry on. He would not be silenced. And the persecuted look forward to the joy that awaits them. The persecuted are like their Lord, enduring the worst because of the best that lies ahead. As James has written, "Blessed is the man who perseveres under trial, because when he has stood the test, he'll receive the crown of life that God has promised to those who love him." Well, we've come to the end of the Beatitudes in Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. But we haven't come to the end of this series of videos. And that's because there are other blessings that Jesus mentions. And we're going to look at a few of them in the weeks ahead. And those Beatitudes, like the ones that we've been studying, will lead to joy. I bid you joy.